The MiG-15. Ever since American pilots first spotted it in the skies over North Korea, and even after the comparable American F-86 Sabre entered combat, the U.S. Air Force had wanted to get its hands on one of these Soviet fighter jets. It was this strong desire that led to a controversial program known as Operation Moolah, in which the U.S. government offered any Chinese, Russian, or North Korean pilot $100,000, about $1 million today, if he defected to a U.S. air base with a fully operational MiG-15. The United States launched a massive propaganda campaign to try and entice enemy pilots. They bombarded the airwaves north of Japan and dropped over 1 million leaflets over large parts of North Korea and China. But when on July 27, 1953, the Korean War officially ended, no fighter pilot had taken up the offer. That is, until 2 months later, when suddenly out of the blue, a MiG-15 dropped into the Americans' lap, or rather, straight onto the runway at Kimpo Air Base in South Korea. As the American servicemen rushed toward the enemy aircraft with guns drawn, a young North Korean pilot slowly emerged, threw a photo of North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung onto the ground, and after turning over his pistol, surrendered himself to military authorities. This is the story of that young pilot's daring escape to freedom, the United States' determined quest to acquire a working MiG-15, and the dramatic consequences of both. It's no surprise that after seeing a MiG-15 for the first time, American military leaders wanted to learn more about it. When it first appeared in the skies over Korea, the mysterious swept-wing fighter shocked U.S. pilots who had never seen anything like it. In the early days of the war, the United States had easily established air superiority over the entire Korean peninsula. North Korea, with its fragile fleet of outdated Soviet IL-10s, LA-9s, and Yaks, had stood little chance against the Americans with their modern fighter jets and battle-hardened pilots. In fact, within the first few months of the war, American B-29 bombers were already crisscrossing the country and dropping bombs with impunity over North Korean targets. By September, just 4 months into the conflict, American B-29s had flown 4,000 sorties and dropped over 30,000 tons of explosives while only losing 4 aircraft. But that superiority ended in October 1950 when China entered the war. That month, 300,000 Chinese troops snuck across the Yalu River, marking a new, much deadlier phase in the fighting. And as China began pushing back against the American army on the ground, Stalin began to fill the skies with Soviet aircraft. He sent highly trained Soviet pilots, veterans of World War II, to not only train the North Koreans, but to secretly engage in direct air-to-air combat with the Americans. The new MiG-15s blindsided the American pilots, who at that point were still mostly flying P-51s and F-80 Shooting Stars, neither of which could match the speed and agility of the MiG. Add to that the fact that these MiG-15s were flown by the Soviet Union's top pilots, and it's easy to see why the northwest border between North Korea and China soon became notorious for its fierce dogfights. Pretty soon, the same B-29 pilots who had once dominated the skies were fearing for their lives each time they went out for a bombing run. The MiG-15, with experienced Soviet airmen at the controls, used their high speed and maneuverability to pick off the B-29s, while threatening the once dominant United States Air Force. The extent of the new threat became all too apparent during one aerial battle that came to be known as Black Thursday. On that day, 39 B-29 superfortresses were flying toward targets in North Korea with an escort of 50 F-84 Thunderjets, when all of a sudden, 30 MiG-15s came screaming down from above them. They hammered the B-29s with their powerful cannons and brought down 3 while badly damaging 7 others. That single event was so shocking to American military leaders that they grounded all of their bombers for the next 3 months until the more advanced F-86 Sabre could finally arrive. But even when the F-86 Sabre appeared in December 1950, the MiG-15 continued to be a danger. The F-86 Sabre was faster than the older F-80s and P-51s that the Americans had been using up to that point. But the MiG-15 could still operate at higher altitudes, had a better rate of climb, and with its 23 and 37 millimeter cannons, it had a longer range than the F-86. For all of those reasons, military leaders decided they needed to get their hands on a working MiG, And it was out of that desire that Operation Moolah was born. With a generous cash prize and the promise of political asylum, they hoped that some disillusioned pilot would deliver the very aircraft that had been so devastating to American forces. Unfortunately for the Americans, however, their timing wasn't great. Operation Moolah was launched just a few months before the end of the war. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, no fighter pilot had come forward with a MiG. And when a North Korean pilot did finally deliver one a couple of months later, the political situation had completely changed. At that point, North Korea and the United States were officially at peace. The MiG-15 was no longer the Soviet Union's most advanced aircraft, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had always hated the idea of paying what he called a communist thief, did everything he could to go back on his promise. Of course, the North Korean pilot who defected, No Kum Sok, was unaware of any of this when he woke up on the morning of Monday, September 21, 1953, and prepared himself for what he knew could be his final flight. In fact, he had never even heard of Operation Moolah. When 21-year-old No Kum Sok made his escape, it was for freedom, not money. When the Americans had dropped their leaflets advertising Operation Moolah, No and the rest of the communist pilots had been far away in Manchuria and had never heard of the program. Moreover, they wouldn't have grasped the significance of $100,000, having no idea what a dollar was worth. In any case, No had always been an ardent anti-communist. Ever since joining the North Korean Air Force at the age of 17, he had blended in by shouting communist slogans, all the while inwardly fantasizing about a free life in America. At night, he often dreamed that he was gazing up at the Empire State Building, only to wake up the next day still stuck in a communist dictatorship. Throughout the grueling 3 years of the Korean War, No flew tantalizingly close to his objective over and over again. He felt closer to the Americans he was fighting against than to his own country. But despite flying on over 100 missions and never once shooting down an American plane, he was still the enemy, which meant any attempt to cross the border in a Soviet plane would have made him a target. It wasn't until September 21, 1953, 8 weeks after the war ended, that No finally got his opportunity. Stationed just 13 miles from the South Korean border, he suddenly broke away from a routine flight one morning and headed straight for it. The aircraft he was flying was the latest version of the MiG-15, the MiG-15 BIS, equipped with a VK-1 engine that allowed the aircraft to fly at an astonishing 669 miles per hour. No used all of that thrust to pull away from his scheduled patrol while gunning it south toward Kimpo Air Base, just across the border. Despite the lull in hostilities, what No was attempting to pull off was nearly a suicide mission. Behind him lay his fellow North Korean pilots who wouldn't hesitate to shoot down a defector. Ahead lay the full power of the American anti-aircraft defense system, along with a swarm of F-86 Sabres patrolling the skies. No gave himself just a 20% chance of surviving, but luck was on his side that day. The radar system at Kimpo happened to be shut down for maintenance, meaning the Americans didn't see the Soviet MiG until it was coming in for landing at the airbase. Even then, the few pilots who saw it didn't recognize it as the enemy. In fact, that lack of recognition nearly led to a deadly crash as he landed. With the wind at his back and descending toward the runway in the wrong direction, No came dangerously close to hitting an F-86 as it approached the runway from the opposite direction. As he brought his plane down, he did everything he could to signal his peaceful intentions to the Americans below. He lowered his wing flaps, rocked his wings back and forth, and fired off a series of colored flares, hoping they wouldn't be mistaken for rockets. Then he prayed. Fortunately, no one shot at him, but the oncoming F-86 was still coming in fast toward him, seemingly unaware of his presence. No veered to the right of the runway and shut his eyes. At the last second, the American pilot saw him and swerved in the opposite direction, barely avoiding a fatal collision. When No finally parked his MiG, chaos erupted on the runway. Airmen streamed out of their planes to get an up-close look at the mysterious fighter jet and its pilot. That was when No jumped out, threw down the photo that had been framed in the MiG's cockpit, and surrendered himself. For No Kum Sok, it was a joyous moment to finally be able to breathe the fresh air of freedom. For the United States, that moment also should have been a joyous one. After all, they had finally acquired the notorious Soviet fighter jet that they had obsessed over for so long. But as it turns out, their long-awaited MiG was not the prize that they had hoped it would be. As soon as No gave himself over to the American authorities, the questioning began. Over the course of the next weeks and months, American translators attempted to get as much information out of him as possible, and No was more than happy to help in any way he could. He told them all about the location of North Korean air bases, the involvement of Soviet fighter pilots during the Korean War, and other details regarding equipment and personnel. But when it came to the fabled MiG-15, there was really only one way to discover its intricacies: take it up into the sky. For that job, the U.S. entrusted two record-setting test pilots, Chuck Yeager, who had broken the speed barrier back in 1947, and Tom Collins, who had set a speed record for the F-86 Sabre. At an airbase on Okinawa, the two veterans pushed the MiG-15 to its limits, engaging in fast-paced chases and maneuvers. As they flew, they were struck by the aircraft's impressive climb rate and altitude, but they also quickly discovered that it was full of dangers. For one thing, there was no pre-stall warning, meaning that at high velocity the MiG could suddenly enter into a death spiral from which the pilot often never recovered. A white stripe was painted down the middle of the instrument panel to help the pilot stabilize the aircraft, but this often wasn't enough. In fact, No had even seen his own flight instructor die this way. The Americans learned a lot from testing the MiG, but the moment still must have felt anticlimactic. After years of watching the MiG-15 dance through American fighter squadrons and take down numerous B-29s, the information gained from the MiG was not as crucial as it once may have been. That's because by the time the famous MiG-15 finally fell into their hands, it was already becoming obsolete, replaced by the newer MiG-17, a supersonic fighter jet that would go on to be used by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. What's more, North Korea and the United States had just signed an armistice, and President Eisenhower worried that taking possession of the MiG-15 would only serve to damage that fragile peace. So, once testing was complete, the United States tried to return the stolen plane that they had worked so hard to acquire. They offered it to North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, but all three countries declined. Finally, it was shipped off to the United States and eventually ended up on display in a museum in Dayton, Ohio, where it remains to this day. For No Kum Sok, however, it's impossible to overstate just how much his escape in the MiG transformed his life. From living under the iron fist of authoritarian rule to becoming a citizen of the United States, the country he had dreamed about his entire life, the change was extraordinary. After some reluctance from President Eisenhower, No was eventually paid the $100,000 that he had been promised as part of Operation Moolah, and he used that money to study aeronautical engineering, eventually graduating and becoming a university professor. But while No Kum Sok celebrated his new freedom, those that were left behind were not so lucky. Once Kim Il-sung learned about the escape, he rounded up and executed 5 of No Kum Sok's fellow pilots, including his best friend. For anyone stuck living under Kim Il-sung's brutal dictatorship, their lives continued to be tightly controlled, with food rations, strict hierarchy, and prison camps all forming an unbreakable part of daily life. Today, the chances of escaping from North Korea remain slim, but that has not stopped several other North Korean pilots from following in No Kum Sok's footsteps. As long as North Korea continues to be an authoritarian state, there will always be new attempts to escape across the border. And while the aircraft may change, the objective will always remain the same: freedom.